Hello, Booktube. All right, we're back for part 2 of our 2.7 or 2.6K Q&A. And we are at Daniel Jones. What are your thoughts on the schism forming between the Orthodox Donohuguenots and the Reformed Donohuguenots who heretically claim that the Barsetshire series is better than the Palliser series? I think you should fight it out. Question number 2. Have you ever considered hosting Zoom conversations with other booktubers? Well, yes, I have. As you know, this question has become a little dated because I have. I posted a couple and I want to do more. None of you are safe. It's a little bittersweet because announcing on my channel over and over again that I now want to have Zoom conversations with every booktuber will start to show me which booktubers don't want to do that. It'll be an odd, indirect way of learning which booktubers just don't like me, because what other reason could there be, right? A normal person might say, no, it's not that I don't like you, it's just that I have stage fright. But a booktuber can't say that because they're in front of the camera every week. But in answer to the question, I absolutely love the experience so far. Absolutely love it. A long, long time ago, I did interviews with authors and performers and conductors and directors, and they were face to face. But I had a little spiral-bound reporter's pad where I was taking notes the whole time. I got very good at interviewing, but it was face to face for a different venue, and I was able to gussy it up for the paper. Doing it live is a little bit different, but I find that a lot of the muscles haven't gone away, so that's great. And question number 3, when will your autobiography be released? Yes, my autobiography, Odd Dog, 1,200 pages. I am strongly thinking about it, let's put it that way. Maybury Book Club says, have you ever met Mr. Rogers? No. What did you think of him? Tremendously impressive. Will it ever be safe again to take the train to Boston? Will I ever be able to have a brattle day with Steve? Well, in order for it to be safe for you to take the train to Boston, the pandemic that is now raging out of control in the United States has to be under control. And that isn't going to happen for another 16 years. So, 2036, if you're still alive and I'm still alive in 2036 and the brattle is still around, that may be a time when you get to do that. But the pandemic is going to rage out of control with thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even a million people dead for the next 16 years. So I wouldn't put it on your immediate list of things to do. Claire O'Connor says, I have a barrage of questions. Well, that's nothing new on these Q&As, is it? Number 1, can you make sense of the recent viral video WAP? Is it a fine example of sexual liberation? I'm certainly confused by it. Like, what are young boys and girls like you and I supposed to think about such a pop culture that has every man fully clothed and standing still and every woman nearly naked and twerking? Well, you describe it perfectly. It's just standard hip-hop music video misogyny. It's just there's no real worth to it that I can see. Question number 2, do you think Reagan was a good president? How much time do you have? I covered Reagan on the editorial side, not just the book reviewing side, in the news for quite some time. The answer to this question is going to boil down to what you mean by a good president, because the presidency is as much about intangibles as it is about policy. It becomes more about policy when you have a president like Reagan who was so thoroughly dominant in the political role, so that a lot of his policy opinions became national reality. But I myself always believe that the presidency is mostly about intangibles. Is this a person that the country can be proud as president? Is this a person who conducts himself well in public? Is this a person who evinces certain intangibles that everyone values? Is this a person whose intangibles uplift the country? And in Reagan's case, that was mostly true. Even though there was a vocal group, a vocal section of the country that hated him, it was mostly true that he made Americans feel good that he was president. And you can look, you can have a president who is genuinely funny and who will often take speeches that were written for him by a speechwriting staff and rewrite them himself, making them better in the process, and who won the Nobel Prize. And then you have a president who can barely drag his way through primary school writing on teleprompters, who reads from teleprompters as if they were hostage videos, who mispronounces normal words and then claims that the way everyone else has been pronouncing them for 1,000 years is wrong and that he's right, who draws hurricane paths on maps with a marker like a child, who's laughed at, mocked, belittled, denigrated, and made a fool of all over the world. That president is failing at intangibles, whereas Reagan did not largely fail at intangibles. So, you know, it's a tough question. A whole video about Reagan would not be enough time for me to dissect him. And number 3, what kind of history reading do you think is crucial for everyone to do? In other words, what are some events / times in history that you think have an abundance of valuable lessons? Not first. Not history reading first. No. What I think is vital for everyone to do is to know where your own power is. And most people don't. Most people listening to me right now, if my Google Analytics are correct, then 90% of the people listening to me right now are Americans. And I would be willing to bet that of that 90%, probably 95% of those people can't name even one of their own state representatives. The people who represent them at the national level of government. I'd be willing to bet that probably 80% of that 90% of Americans can't name their senators, the most powerful representatives they send to government. I'd be willing to bet that most of those people don't have any real basic functional understanding of how the American government works, how a law is made, where the balance of power is in Congress, all that sort of stuff. If you don't know that, if you don't know your city council, if you're not involved in your own power, then reading about, you know, Periclean Athens is not going to be vital. It's not going to help at all. You'll just be a really well-informed lemming. And what difference does that make? So when it comes to reading, I suggest you read up on your own politics. And that applies elsewhere, too. That applies even if you're not American. It's just in America, we're heading into a presidential election that's going to be one of the most hotly contested presidential elections in American history. And that makes it all the more maddening for me that Americans are so staggeringly ignorant of their own government. And don't get me started on the fact that 55% of registered American voters won't show up. They won't bother to vote at all. When one of the candidates has already said he's going to defund Social Security, he's already tried in court, is trying right now in court to remove your health care. One of these presidential candidates, one of the candidates in the 2020 election, is literally an existential threat to your health and happiness. And yet 51% of the country won't vote. Anyway, Jonathan Noel says, any advice for people who have just graduated with a BA in literature? Learn to code. Trip asks, how detailed do you personally make your plot when you're planning out a novel? I.e., what is the gist of a scene that you can expand upon when you write? How many words or pages are you plotting, documents, etc., after Preptober for a NaNoWriMo project? I tend to plot a lot, but not restrictively. If you plot so restrictively that you feel like all that you have to do during the day is just do a treadmill, if you've got your steps on, you've got your Fitbit, and you've got to get your steps in, that'll remove the joy. There's got to be some on the ground, in the moment creativity, but a fairly detailed outline. So where I need to get everything from when I start writing today to when I stop writing today, that helps a lot. That prevents you from just wandering off into the daffodils. Next question. What is your opinion of Friedrich Schiller and Bertolt Brecht? I like Schiller a lot more. Any chance we'll see Simplicius Simplicis? No. On a Penguin Shelf, no, I do not have Simplicius Simplicitus. I don't have it. I don't want to either. It's a boring book. PHXSNS1 says, thoughts on a couple of books and a movie. Anton Meyer's Once an Eagle, I thought it was boring. Ralph Ellison's unfinished novel, Juneteenth. The author didn't finish it, so I don't have much to say about it. And the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Ever seen it in a theater? Is it possible to watch the Rocky Horror Picture Show without seeing it in a theater at midnight? Yes, I have seen it many times in a theater at midnight. Tomorrow's Classic asks, what did you think of that awful sounding Beowulf translation you got in the mail the other day? The one that started with bro. Yes, we had fun with that. But then I immediately read it because although it was a paperback release, its date came right up. Its date was at the end of August. So I immediately read it that day. And I was really impressed. I really was. The authors linguistic ability, rhetorical ability. It's just off the charts. The stuff that she does metrically, rhythmically, audibly, the sounds, the rhymes, the images, the clashing stuff that she brings together on almost every line of the poem is just astonishing, just amazing as a feat of creativity. It is worthless as a translation of Beowulf because the author adds things to make her point. She has a point to make, a political point to make, a 21st century, 2020 political point to make. And that'd be fine if you want to maybe jiggle the language here and there to stress what isn't stressed in the original poem. But she doesn't just do that. She invents things. And that means that it's pastiche. It's not a translation. Because it's totally unreliable. If you don't know the original poem and you're reading her poem, you'll think, wow, I never knew any of this. And there's a reason you didn't know it, because it isn't real. Because it isn't anything like what the poem actually says. So it's kind of a split thing. I strongly recommend the book as a reading experience. I strongly recommend it. It will blow you away. But this is not a question of a translator taking a liberty here and there with the particular reading of a word or a phrase or pacing. This is a translator just making things up. So you don't put any weight on it as a translation, but definitely read it. Supportive Word says, what size feet do you have? Size 12. Size 12, and they're a little bit long. And on top of that, I have what an orthopedist referred to as a nervous toe. My big toe on both feet is the thing that pulls the rest of my foot up every time I raise my foot. I have a nervous toe. So I have lost count of the number of shoes I've had where the toe my big toe just pokes a hole right through the shoe, and that's when I need to replace it. The solution that I've worked out for that is to buy size 13 shoes. It gives my foot plenty of room to swim around in there, and it causes it. I haven't poked a toe through the front of a shoe in a long time. Once I started doing that, getting size 13 shoes. And do you wear socks and slippers when you're recording your Booktube videos indoors or bare feet? Well, it depends. I'd like to wear nothing. I'd like to wear neither shoes nor socks or slippers of any kind. I think slippers of even a minimal kind would probably incense my little schnauzer to the point where she couldn't control herself. She views feet as interlopers in her domain anyway. If I were to get like fuzzy, walrus slippers or something like that, she would go ballistic. But you have to keep in mind, I have 3 ironclad rules for existence, unfortunately, since I'm incredibly old. 1 is that I'm always hungry. 2 is that the music is always too loud. And the 3rd is that I'm always cold. So I would like to wear no clothes at all, but I nevertheless do. View from the bar. Oh no, a well-known troublemaker. All right, Donoghue. See, he's already starting out aggressively. He's got a barrage of questions too. Number 1, you've made clear what you think about the NRA, about the national cult of gun ownership. But I don't think I've heard you speak about gun ownership as a general practice. Do you think any gun should be legal? No. Not assault weapons. A marksman's rifle, sure, that you go to the range to practice with. Something for hunting. Hunting shouldn't be legal, but if hunting is legal, maybe a gun for hunting. But a gun where you put a tiny feather amount of pressure on the trigger and 1,500 rounds come out in a minute, that is a weapon of war. That is only meant to kill people, humans. And no, that should not be legal. Of course not. No civilian should have access to such a thing. You've mentioned some distinct opinions about, for instance, trial by jury. Do I? Have I? Not on my channel. Maybe to you. Do you have any general thoughts on the Second Amendment? Maybe its distortion, changes you'd make to it, etc., etc. I wouldn't make any changes to it. It's perfectly fine. What I would do is rip out the tongues of the people who lie about it. The Second Amendment is perfectly fine. It's perfectly clear that for the maintenance of a well-ordered militia, the right of an individual to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In other words, in plain text, in black and white, in normal English that we can all read and use today, the Second Amendment protects your right to own and operate a gun in a militia, in a well-ordered state militia, not as a private individual. There is no private individual right to gun ownership anywhere in the Constitution. especially in the Second Amendment. No, the Second Amendment makes clear what it says. If you're going to be an arch-conservative, paleo-conservative, Barry Goldwater conservative a-hole, and stick to your Second Amendment and venerate the Founding Fathers, they were smart guys, they knew what they were talking about, then what are you going to tell me? They were smart guys, they knew what they were talking about, except for this one amendment where they suddenly lost the greatest command of the English language that the founding members of any nation have ever had, including Pericles in Athens. So isn't that funny? That their unparalleled command of the English language deserted them just then. No, it didn't. The Second Amendment is as clear as a bell. If you're a member of a well-ordered militia in your state, you have a right to own and keep a gun. The understanding being that the well-ordered militia in your state was not going to provide a gun. You would have to provide it. But that only for that context. It's clearly stipulated. Anyway. Number 2. What did your sainted ma think of Kennedy? He's too young to be president. Question number 3. What's Hitchcock's best movie? I have a fondness for Rope. Number 4. I often think how Orson Welles would have made such a great use of podcasting, of YouTube, etc. I don't agree. He'd have disdained it. Unless there was a huge amount of money involved. So one of these, the 5 podcasts that make money, one of those, sure. And maybe he would be today's Joe Rogan, only instead of getting high as a kite before he talks to every guest, he'd get drunk before he talked to every guest. Who are some figures from the past you would love to bring to the modern day to see how they'd take advantage of our current platforms? For example, Buster Keaton on TikTok, Dorothy Parker on Twitter. Yeah, thanks, View from the Bar. I actually have an imagination of my own. I don't need you to lead me around by strings to come up with examples. But anyway, my answer to this question wouldn't work anyway. It wouldn't be helpful, because if you're going to give me a hypothetical in which I can bring people back from the past, they're all going to be friends of mine. So they're not going to be dispositive to the subject of the question. But I'm not going to use that power for anybody else. So, and then let's see, number 5. If a publisher handed you a big check and said, we want you to write a biography of any 20th century figure of your choice with free access to all the necessary documents, cooperation of estates, etc., which subject would you choose? Apart from Taft and apart from Sasquatch. Well, who's answering the question here? Bub? Pal o' mine? You or me? But if I had such a thing, I would probably make it a multi-person biography. I would do a literary history of Boston. A big, personality-driven literary history of Boston. So I guess maybe you could do that with William Dean Howells. Maybe you just shorten it to that. Or Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Hasn't had a big biography in 150 years. Maybe him. Then Jeff Messerman asks, are you able to describe in under 5,000 words how fortunate you feel to be taken under the golden wings of the finest radio producer in the land? Or is this just a shameless attempt by said producer to get you to mention the Steve Donoghue Show on your Q&A? Jeff Messerman. Name's not ringing a bell. But nevertheless, whoever he is, he raises a good point, which is that I have a podcast. I mentioned podcasts that don't make any money. I have one of those. I have a podcast for the Cedarburg Public Library in Wisconsin. It's every weekday, Monday through Friday. Me opining about some literary subject that happens to be the bee in my bonnet that day. I'll leave a link. The link to it is in all of my my information block down below. Only unlike the link to my Patreon page, you probably shouldn't ignore it. Omnipotent Poobah, how are we doing for time? Oh, we're fine. If all goes as planned and Biden triumphs against the forces of darkness in November, that's not the plan, and that's not going to happen. Might as well start steeling yourself for it now. Then at some point during early 2021, the feelers will go out for someone to ghostwrite a suitably flattering tome for Trump's memoirs / political autobiography. Who do you think would be best placed to undertake such a challenging work of fiction, and why? Well, it's hypothetical, because Trump's still going to be in power. He's not going to leave power. In the hypothetical example that you described, where Biden triumphs, where he wins by a landslide in the election, and Donald Trump is removed from the White House, Donald Trump is not going to concede under any circumstances, even a Biden landslide. He's not going to concede, and he's going to do what he's always done, which is to weaponize the legal system of the United States as a personal tool of himself. As long as he can find judges who won't throw his case out and hold him in contempt for filing it, he will continue to do that. And that's what he's going to do. If Biden wins by a landslide, or if Biden wins at all, if the election is close, anything like that. He's already signaled that he's going to do it. He's already pretty much guaranteed he's going to litigate it forever, and that whole time he's going to call himself president. But that's not going to happen anyway. But one way or another, in the hypothetical that you described, I think that Donald Trump, I know that there are some pundits who say this is going too far, but I think Donald Trump stands a real significant chance of being indicted and going to jail if he is a normal citizen in 2021. So I'm not sure what memoirs there would be. I don't think that there's any way to spin it. There'll be plenty of people who will try. You know, that for one brief shining moment there was a spot named Camelot. People are going to say that about Trump's time in office. In the hypothetical you described, in reality he's not going to leave office. So he's not going to leave power. So it's not going to matter. And number 2, our book group recently had quite a heated discussion on Donna Tartt, purveyor of baggy monsters versus something special, etc., etc. Where do you stand? Obviously, the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. She's a competent writer, very much so. She can turn out a really involving book. She's incredibly lazy, and incredibly entitled, and has surrounded herself by yes men toadies. And that is the only thing that could possibly explain why it takes her 35 years to write a book. It doesn't take 35 years to write The Goldfinch. It doesn't take oh wow, Donna Tartt has a new book out for the fall list. Boy, my grandfather was a boy when she had her last book. That's just ridiculous. That's just ridiculous. It just means that, well, one way or another, she's very good. She's venerated as the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that she's not. Obviously, she's not that. Even the books that are... The Little Friend is not venerated, but The Goldfinch is, and so is The Secret History. And just go back and read The Secret History. That's all you have to do. Don't take my word for any of this. Go back and read The Secret History. You will see a fairly competent campus mystery, and nothing else. So, let's see here. Dylan McMahon has a barrage of questions. How are we doing for time? All right, we'll get through Dylan. Number 1, thoughts on Bret Easton Ellis. His books, you mean? Bret Easton Ellis as a person, I could tell you stories. But his books, I think, are good. Number 2, favorite Dennis Cooper book. That would be The Sluts. No, he only had the 2 questions. The barrage comes from, it's from John Doherty, and I copied it twice. It's his same old questions. All right, let's move on to that I did already. This I did already. Oh, no. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, it looks like Scalawag asked... We had Scalawag, I think, in the last video, asked 3 questions instead of 2. The third question was, what out-of-print book, more than any other, do you feel deserves to be back in print? And any is in all caps. And if you watch Q&As like this, I don't have much use for questions that impose a hypothetical and then impose a bunch of hypotheticals on it. If I could bring back an out-of-print book, then more than any other, the book more than any other, I don't have an answer to more than any other. But there are plenty of authors who aren't remembered who did really good work. One that I mentioned on this channel is a novelist named Stephen Becker, whose works are out of print. They will stay out of print, but they are very, very good, especially The Blue-Eyed Sean. But also he did an American Civil War novel called When This War Is Over. It was also quite good. Let's see here. How are we doing for time? All right, let's keep going. Chapter 21 says, your thoughts on Philip Reeve? Never read Philip Reeve. Your thoughts on Taran Matharu? Never read Taran Matharu. Your thoughts on Darren Shan? Never read Darren Shan. Oh, wow, that was a clean sweep, wasn't it? I've never read any of them. Are they good? Should I read them? Zulu Blades says, long-time listener, first-time caller. Number 1, Baron Corvo, Frederick Rolf. In 4 years of loyal watching, I cannot recall a mention from you. Would love to hear your thoughts, whether about A.J. Simon's cult classic biography or Rolf's work itself. Given his preoccupation with the Italian Renaissance and Venetian life in general, surely you've taken a look. I have. It's never done anything for me the way it does for so many people. But that, I think, may be because I lived in Venice. I knew it as a place rather than an eccentric fetish. And so when I am dealing with it characterized as an eccentric fetish, it loses its appeal. And number 2, Wyndham Lewis was delighted to hear you mention The Apes of God as an example of modernist work with some merit, while eviscerating Joyce during a live stream with Mark. Are there any other works of his you'd particularly rate? All of them. Wyndham Lewis is worth reading. Ulysses 92 says 2 questions. Number 1, after finishing a particularly great book, I often feel I need to give time to digest it before I start a new book. Do you ever experience book hangovers like this? I don't, but if you do, you should respect them, obviously. I sometimes feel like it cheapens the experience to move on to another book immediately. Well, okay, if you feel that way, then you should do that. But again, don't fetishize it. All over YA Booktube, there are people who have made such a big deal out of quote-unquote book hangovers that I can't help but notice sometimes the book hangovers last for months. And the clock is ticking. You're visibly older than you were yesterday. In about 10 minutes, you're going to be dead. So no, let's not overdo it with book hangovers. And then I've seen you mention classic sci-fi that you like in previous videos. Can you name some modern 21st century sci-fi writers that you enjoy? China Miéville, Shishimu, N.K. Jemisin, when N.K. Jemisin is not being blatantly racist. A whole bunch. James Corey, even. I have him up on the shelf there. His space opera Shaggy Dog story is terrific. I don't know what's happened to the light here. I'm not as gorgeous as I should be. Is that any better? Let's try that. Plus, the bean is going nuts. Because this has been going on a while. Why are you going nuts? Huh? Why are you acting up? So sweet. Let's see here. How we do? Okay. Oh, let's stop here. All right, we'll stop here and we'll come right back.